Hey everybody, Ryan here at eTrailer. Today on our 2023 Ford F-150, we're going to be showing you how to install the Roadmaster RoadActive suspension enhancement system. But before we get into that, why don't we just take a couple of minutes, do some tests, check these out, and make sure they're going to work for you. Before we actually get our suspension enhancement installed, we like to do a little before and after. That way we have something to compare to, So right now we have the factory setup on our truck, and we'll go through our test course, get our new parts on, and see if it makes a difference. And this is the exact setup that our neighbor here today is towing. He's got this little camper here, and he said although the truck does pretty good, he notices a lot of porpoising, which more or less means, you hit a bump and the front end comes up and then it's kind of just sloppy, like you're almost riding a wave. So that's what he's kind of hoping to eliminate. I think they should do a pretty good job at that, at least making it a lot more manageable, and hopefully get some other benefits out of them too. A little less body roll. Maybe we can get the back of the truck up a little bit more and prevent it from squatting as much. So we'll find out. But with that said, why don't we hop in and take it for a spin and see how it actually does. In the truck here, we're hooked up to our camper, and what we're gonna do is go over some bumps, and essentially right away I can tell what our neighbor's talking about here. And this is just going over the first couple. The trailer just hit them. What I'm feeling, it's almost floating. It's super sloppy. Like we go over the bump, and while the front end is doing this deal, the back almost feels like it's not wanting to stay on the ground, if that makes sense. Almost like we're riding a wave almost. And so I can definitely see why I'd want to correct that. We're going a couple miles an hour here and I can feel it. So I can only imagine if you're running 60 mile an hour down the highway, hitting a bump over a bridge or something, it's probably a lot worse. And so hopefully, what this will do, correct it or make it a lot more manageable. And I even feel it kind of swaying too almost. The truck kind of side to side, and it's just not as planted as I personally would like it to be. So a couple issues there that we'll see if they improve once we get our parts on. So what we're going to try to do now is a little evasive maneuvering, doing some turns and stuff. We don't have a ton of space to work with here, but we'll do our best. And I'm not going to get too crazy here going at speed, but what I'm trying to do is get some body roll going in the truck, and I feel it a little bit. It's actually doing pretty good with our camper. I can feel it wanting to go some. Like I said, I wish I could get a little more aggressive. We're just out of space here, and so I can't really get going super fast, but I did feel it some. When you're making that turn, you kind of feel it wanting to lean a little bit, which is to be expected. But it's always nice to have everything be a little more stiff and make you feel a little more planted. It makes it easier on the steering and on just your overall towing experience. So knowing what we know now and how the truck actually handles, with the factory suspension, let's actually see how it works with our enhancement now that we have it installed. And almost immediately, actually just hooking back up to our camper, I noticed a difference. And that's because earlier this morning when I dropped the camper, I had to raise it up so high, was able to drive right out from under the trailer. Well, when we got these installed and I go to back up to it, it was actually, our ball was higher than our trailer coupler. So I know for a fact the back of the truck kind of raised up a little bit, maybe an inch, something like that, inch and a half. I had to get out and raise the camper up higher just to drop it onto our ball mount. But with that said, I'm under full weight right now, and the truck actually looks pretty good. Little bit of squat in the back here, but definitely much better than what it was earlier this morning. But how it looks and everything is one thing. How it's actually going to feel, whole different story. So let's hop in and go for a spin. we're gonna run through our same exact test just to try to keep everything, you know, as identical as possible. So we're running through our bumps here, and even actually just going over these first couple, I can tell there's actually a major improvement. So before, what was happening, yeah, it's a lot better. Before, what was happening, you know, we'd hit these bumps, especially when the trailer starts getting into them too, and we'd just be floating around. Don't get me wrong, there's still a little bit of that there, but it is not nearly as bad as what it was. Now you kind of get that initial floaty feeling, and then it comes back down, and it's solid, right? And the truck just feels, I don't know if it's stiffer per se, because it's actually still pretty comfortable ride when we're hitting these bumps, but almost just more responsive. Like it's just handling the weight that much better. We're not kind of pushing it to its limits, you know, not floating around, or when, you know, we hit that initial bump, it's not super jarring, kind of like what it once was. You know, everything's a little more predictable, and much more of a comfortable ride, honestly. As far as our little sway course here, again, don't have a ton of space to work with, a little more than what we did this morning. So we'll see what happens, if I notice anything different or not. I'd assume they're definitely not going to hurt anything. And I feel like you could get a little more aggressive with the steering. You know, earlier we had a little bit of body roll, not much, and I'd say it's definitely better. It definitely didn't hurt anything. And I feel like this is almost, you know, when you're towing a camper or trailer in general, when you're making them turns, it's not like you're flying around them, right? You're not racing around a track. So, you know, how much body roll you actually get is just going to kind of depend on your particular load. Now, what I've done in the past is actually put a water tank in the bed, and that's where it's really noticeable, because it kind of starts sloshing around. And with a load like that, you know, you're definitely able to tell a major improvement in terms of body roll and things of that nature. So depending on what you're pulling, you know, you might notice a little difference when it comes to that or not. Initial thoughts after the test course, you know, do they work? Absolutely. I noticed a pretty big improvement. And one of the things that I noticed with these is you get that extra stability and whatnot, but the ride is still pretty comfortable. You know, I've noticed in the past, like say with airbags or air springs, you get the stability, but it's almost rock solid in the back of the truck. You know, you just don't have a whole lot of comfort there. Everything's just so firm. You feel everything kind of going through the chassis and the truck, and you feel it in the seat, you know, where it kind of beats you up a little bit more. These were actually a pretty comfortable ride. You know, it was still forgiving, but it still eliminated all those negative effects that we were looking to cure, you know, and so it did a pretty good job of that, and I'm actually kind of a fan of them. But with that said, why don't we pull into the garage and actually see what they look like underneath the truck. They're gonna sit in this position here, kind of on top of our leaf spring, and, you know, for lack of a better term, essentially, you know, these are just going to be, it's almost like adding an adjustable overload spring or extra leaf spring in a sense. And what that's going to do is help kind of enhance what you already have here. You know what I mean? It's just going to enhance your factory suspension and give it some additional help to help accommodate those heavier type loads. And so while you do have some adjustability, it is somewhat limited, and you will have to kind of turn a couple nuts and bolts to be able to do that. But, you know, the way most people use these is kind of set them the first time and forget it, right? You just leave it like that, and that's going to work for most people. But how this works, so when the truck is unloaded, this really isn't doing a whole lot. You know, it's not really going to provide any additional support because you don't need it, which is nice because these newer Fords actually ride fairly decent down the road. They're relatively comfortable. And so if it were me, I wouldn't want something that would be super duper stiff and beating you up whenever you're just driving around, not even towing anything. And so these should do pretty well in that regard. But whenever you put some weight in it, okay, so if I were to kind of push down on this, what's going to happen is the leaf spring is going to want to flatten out, right? Which it's going to bring our Roadmaster shock with it, kind of extending them coils and, you know, giving it that extra support. So that's how it's going to work. And, you know, the heavier the load, the further down that this is going to come down, the more support that this is going to provide. So at the end of the day, you know, I like these. You kind of get a lot of performance with essentially no maintenance. So kind of a good middle of the road suspension enhancement option that'll kind of cover a lot of people's needs, at least in my opinion. As far as getting these installed goes, they're pretty straightforward. In our case, I don't know if Ford just changed a little something with their John's bumper, or if it's because we have a trimmer model, something might be a little bit different. We did have to kind of modify these little spacer blocks up here. It's the first time that we've ran into it. Usually all the F-150s are the same and everything just bolts right up. So, you know, that's something we came across. But as far as getting these installed, I mean, you drop them on, you tighten a couple bolts and adjust the spring, and that's really all there is to it. So one of the more simple suspension enhancements for sure. But if you'd like to stick around, feel free to. We'll go ahead and get started on them now. To begin our installation, we're going to be underneath the back of our truck, and what I did was just temporarily lower and remove the spare tire. Now this is something you don't have to do, but it'll definitely help. Just gives you a lot more room to work under here and kind of see what's going on. Once everything's installed, it'll go back up. But then you need to jack up your truck in a fashion that the rear axle is going to hang, right? So since we're on a drive-on lift, what I did was just chalk our front tires and use a pull jack and lift this up to where the tires are just barely touching my lift. So essentially it's free hanging. For those of you at home, you know, you can use a jack and jack stands, just jack it up by the frame, get it high enough to where the tires will come off the ground. And that will allow us to get our enhancement set up properly. We're starting over here on the passenger side, just to kind of give you a reference, because it's a little bit easier to see in our case. With that said though, the driver's side is going to be set up the exact same way. So once you get, you know, this side done, whatever we do over here, you can simply just do the same thing on the other side of the truck. But what we need to do is remove this John's bumper. So I have an extension and a 13mm size socket. Find the bolt up in there. And you want to hold on to the bolt and the John's bumper because we will be reinstalling this. Now we're able to grab our spring, and when these come shipped, you know, this gold rod is kind of ran down a little bit more just to make it more compact and easier to box up. So you need to kind of unthread this or increase the distance between these two parts here. With the Fords, you don't really need to get too crazy. About like this will work, about the thickness of my hand. That way it'll be a little bit easier to get in place. We can get this in place. So the way this is going to work is this hooked portion here is going to sit, you know, towards the very back of our truck and kind of rest on top of the very end of our leaf spring, while this part is just going to kind of sit on top of the leaf spring itself. So just work that into place and roughly slide it into position. This will kind of just hook around the top of that, and then you want to pull this as far forward as you can. For this piece, you can remove the nut, pull the bolt out in this tube, and you want these to drop below the leaf spring pack there. Put the tube back on, bolt back through the bracket, and reinstall the nut hand tight for now. You want to get your new part, you know, roughly centered and lined up how you want it to set on the leaf spring, and then we're just going to take the slack out of it. So you can kind of hold this gold rod there and then just turn the spring to tighten it, and you're just looking to get it snug as much as you can by hand. Like I said, just to kind of eliminate any of that slack that's in there. With that slack gone, You want to make sure that this piece, is pushed up against the bottom of the leaf spring pack and centered, and then we're just going to tighten it down. So this nut is a 3/4 inch in size. On the other side of it, it's an Allen head bolt. That'll be a 10 millimeter in size, and we'll tighten this stuff up. At this point, we can set the preload by turning a nut, which I'll show you in just a moment. But whenever you turn that nut, what's going to happen is it's going to preload the spring. So where the coils are, the gaps are going to get bigger and bigger the tighter you make that nut. And the kit is going to come with 2 of these spacers, or essentially just like a feeler gauge, if you will. The white one is a little bit thinner than this black one, and what one you want to use just depends on the level of support or how aggressive the preload's going to be that you're looking for. So if you were to look for a little bit less aggressive, you tighten that nut until you could just get the white feeler gauge in between the coils. Same holds true with the black one here. Just a little bit bigger, so you tighten it down more, increasing the space in between the coils until this fits in. We're going to use the black one today. Give us kind of maximum support or performance, if you will. So we'll go ahead and start to get that done. So this is what you're going to turn to, adjust that preload. A lot of times when you're doing this, you're not going to have to hold the other side. It's kind of got enough tension in it to preload the spring. But if your whole entire assembly wants to spin and nothing's happening, on the very end of our component here, there will be a nut you can hold steady with a 24 millimeter open-end wrench or crescent wrench to prevent that from happening. But like I said, in our case, we're not having to deal with that. That's my experience too. A lot of other vehicles, so we'll just continue to rotate this until we get the proper setting. Just to kind of clarify, this is that nut I was referring to. So if you're turning this to just a preload and this is spinning, that's what you can hold still, for this to be able to adjust. With that said too, if you run out of room, if you keep tightening it and these nuts hit, you just, always back them up and give you a little more space. But as I'm turning this, it happens really slow, the spaces start to enlarge in between each coil there. And it's not a bad idea every now and again, every 10 or 20 turns or something, whatever, take the spacer that you're going to be using and just try to see if it'll fit in between those gaps. If it does, great. If not, you have to keep adjusting. Got that adjusted out to where our black feeler gauge can kind of just sneak in between, the springs there. So I'm going to call that good. And then I have these 2 jam nuts, right? Take the first one and run it down. You want to run it down towards the coil spring. And then just bump it with a 24 millimeter. Take the other jam nut, run it down, and bump it tight as well. Now we can get our spacer blocks installed. And in our case, we're going to have to kind of modify them a little bit. I don't know if it's because of, with our truck being the trimmer edition, or if Ford just released a different style or has multiple styles of John's bumpers. But this is the first time I've ran into this design. So usually what you would do is, if on the bottom of your frame where you originally pulled that John's bumper out, if there's 2 holes in it, and if you have kind of something similar to these on top of your John's bumper, you really don't have to do anything different. You would just simply take the shorter style bolt that they give you, drop that in, take the OEM bolt, and that would bolt up in the existing location, where it says wheel, you want that facing the outside of the frame. That would bolt up, and then, your John's bumper would come through like that, sit flat, and you'd take the nut that they give you and bolt it up. But with ours being a little different, we're going to have to just kind of make it work. So What I'll do is come up with something and show you what we figured out. So if you run into this, this is what you can kind of do to make everything work. So, you know, there was 2 of these roll pins in right out of the box, and on one side, or on the bottom of her frame, where that original bolt goes up, on one side there is kind of a slotted shape that this roll pin fits into, but not on the other side. And so what I did was just knock this one roll pin out. All right, these are kind of pressed in there. You can use a punch that is just about the same size or a hair smaller, and just kind of carefully tap on it until you get this pin out. And then I think what I'm going to do is place this up there, kind of bolt it into position, and then use this as a template to where we can kind of drill a small hole in the frame. That way this roll pin will fit inside like it should. So I actually took out the other roll pin as well because it wasn't lining up like how I thought it would. But that slot there, not really a big deal, but we'll just roughly get this into position here. And we want to make sure it's, you know, straight and everything else. So it looks pretty good. I'll snug it down. That way it'll hold in position. And then I'll use the holes there as a guide, more or less, to put some marks. That way we know where we can drill. I'm going to do it one at a time though. I'm going to make one hole, put the roll pin back in our spacer block, hold it up there, just kind of check everything out, make sure it fits how I want it to, and once you verify that, you know, we'll come back to our other mark and do the same thing. So for now, we'll get this drilled out. That's what I did. That hole that we drilled, I put the roll pin back into our spacer. You just carefully tap it back in, make sure it goes in straight and everything, and then bolted this up, make sure everything lined up, which it did. And I'm just gonna double mark or mark extra good here where this other hole is before we drill it. That way we can kind of see if anything shifted or anything along those lines. That's kind of why I like doing them one at a time, but that done, we'll pull our bolt back out now and get that other hole drilled. Once they're drilled out and you're confident to line up, not a bad idea just to come back with some paint, you know, and paint that bare metal just to help keep it protected and, you know, hopefully prevent corrosion or rust and things like that. Once everything's dry and whatnot, you know, check this out, put it up there, make sure your bolt runs up good. You know, you might have to kind of open up the middle hole a little bit to give your bolt more clearance if it's hitting it or anything like that. But before we kind of secure this or go any further, our Johns pumper, the issue with it is, you see you got this little tab that comes up and there's nothing, you know, for that to slide into or anything along those lines. So what I think we can do is flatten that tab out. Just beat it down with a hammer or cut it off, whatever you want to do. And I think I'm going to utilize this hole that's already in here as an alignment dowel. Kind of eyeball everything up like this. We can put a small hole in our spacer block. That way this is not going to shift or rotate or anything like that. So I'm going to pull this down. Like I said, I'm going to flatten this tab out and see what we can come up with as far as getting an alignment dowel for this. Instead of trying to bend this down, hitting it like this, it's kind of hard because the Johns pumper is so bouncy. You can honestly just set this flat, kind of tap on that lip there to get that to push flat. So what I think I'm going to do, on top of our Johns pumper, this round hole, I want that to be facing towards the inside or towards the center of our truck. You know, here's our spacer block, the wheel will be on this side. Where that lines up, you know, what I think I'm going to do is measure the distance between the center of this little hole and this hole, and then from the center of this hole out to here, wherever that distance lies, and I'm going to drill a hole in this, not all the way through, probably about 3/4 of the way through. And then I just so happen to have an additional roll pin similar to this that I had laying around that I'll put in here and use that as a key, you know, so this isn't going to shift on us. So I got my hole drilled out, and I actually did one on each side just to see one fits better, and my initial you know, thought turned out to be correct. Do it on this side. So I did 1 inch from there, center that hole over, centered it up. And then I took a roll pin, so again, I sourced this one, just pushed it in here because that hole's already there. And, you know, what'll happen is it'll line up, kind of go in there like that. That new bolt we have will drop down through there into the jounce bumper. And, you know, of course, the new one will bolt up like this. So now that we're all sorted, I think we should be in pretty good shape. You can leave that bolt in, take our factory one, and we'll bolt this assembly up into place. Go ahead and make sure that bolt's in there. Get that lined up how we want it. That all bolted up, you know, this piece will go up over the bolt, make sure that pin goes into place there, and then where that bolt comes through, they give you a flange nut that you can use. And the way I like to do these, the flange nut that they give you, take a 15mm socket, put the nut in it, and an extension, and then just get it started by hand. You know, it's a lot easier to kind of feel around up there and get it started. But once you feel it catch, you know, run it all the way down tight by hand, and then of course come back with your tool and actually snug it up. Once you get one side done, you simply just repeat that exact same process over here on the other side of your truck, and you get the jack stands out from under it, put your spare tire back up if you removed it, and things like that. But with all that complete, that'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Roadmaster active suspension enhancement system on our 2023 Ford F-150.